Now, as a Brit that's living here in Australia, it's fair to say there is definitely some amazing things about living here, but on the other hand, there is definitely some overrated things about living here in Australia, things which get very, very hyped up by people who either live here or speak about Australia, things which are massively overhyped compared to what they're actually like here in Australia. And by the way, overrated does not mean by any means. I think a lot of people get that confused. Overrated does not mean that. It just means it's a bit more hyped than it probably should be. And I do actually believe there is quite a lot of things in Australia which, although may be amazing still, are probably hyped a bit more than they should be. We're going to go into that all in today's video, so before we get into it, make sure you give the video a like and subscribe to the channel, and yeah, let's get into some points. So point number one is the major cities in Australia. Now let me explain why I think they're overrated. First of all, are the cities in Australia bad? No, not by any means. In fact, in terms of cities that I've been to around the world, Australian cities are definitely the nicest out of anywhere I've been. They're clean, they're safe, the vibe's good, the scenery in some of them, Perth, Sydney in particular, is incredible. So I'm not talking down on Australian cities at all because they are very nice, but I'm including them in the overrated section because people hype about the Australian cities way more than they do about other smaller, lesser known places in Australia, which a lot of the time I actually think are better than the main cities. Now the main cities are obviously touristy, they're popular, and there's obviously a reason they're hyped because of that. And you know, you look at your typical places that people rave about in Australia, it's the main cities, it's Sydney, it's Melbourne, it's the Gold Coast, it's these typical touristy places. But for me, after spending 2 years in Australia and traveling a lot of the country, some of my favorite places have been smaller towns, places like Darwin, random little towns on the East Coast, towns that are way smaller that you've probably never heard of. Places like Bowen in Queensland, for example, went to there recently. It's a beautiful little town. And for me, whilst Australian cities do deserve some hype, for me, the real Australia is when you get out of the cities, get to see the smaller towns. Often the scenery's better, the people are nicer, and you just have a much better experience in the smaller towns as well. And I think obviously they're never gonna get the hype the main cities get. For me, they definitely deserve the same amount of hype because the real Australia, when you get out of the main cities, is amazing. Australian cities are some of the best I've seen, but in my opinion, a little bit overhyped. Particularly like Sydney, for example. I think Sydney is probably the most overhyped city in Australia. Again, not bad at all. I loved Sydney, but probably a bit overhyped. Point number two is the beaches. Now, once again, this is not saying the beaches aren't good because of course, Australia probably has some of the best beaches in the world. Look at some of these beaches that I've been to, particularly in Western Australia, unbelievable beaches. But why are they overrated? For a number of reasons. First of all, a lot of the time you can't swim in the sea. You have to deal with sharks, jellyfish. In northern Queensland, where I am now, crocodiles. You will be on an amazing beach, the water's looking like crystal clear, all you want to do is swim nice and far out, but there's literally sharks, especially in Perth where the beaches were incredible. I saw videos, I'll put one on the screen, of sharks literally coming right up to the sand pretty much, so you're not even safe if you're like a meter into the sea. So yeah, it looks amazing, but you can't even swim without being on edge at a lot of beaches. Also, the Australian sun is crazy strong, so if you're going to go to the beach in the middle of the day, you're probably only going to go and sit on there for like an hour max because you're going to get so burned. Especially in the summer, it is way too hot to be sitting on the beach in the middle of the day, so it's definitely better to go in the evening. And also with Australian beaches, particularly them amazing ones near the city, they're very, very busy. You look at Bondi Beach, for example, the most famous beach in Australia. It's just so busy, honestly, and whilst it is still an amazing beach and a great place to be, there is so many tourists and it can feel a bit overcrowded. That's why I definitely recommend when you travel, you get to see some of the remote beaches where you're like the only one on the beach. That's the best thing. But all these reasons combined does make the beaches a bit overrated in Australia. They're definitely not overrated looks wise. They look incredible. The sand's amazing. The water is literally crystal clear at a lot of them. But the dangerous creatures combined with the sun and the busyness probably does make Australia's beaches a bit overhyped. Point number 3 is the activities in Australia. Now, I think this is one thing I've learned after being in Australia, and maybe I did expect this, but it's very chilled out, the lifestyle here. Obviously, I knew that was going to be the case, but it's very relaxed. And to be honest, there isn't a lot to do in Australia. Now, that's not me complaining, because personally, I love that. I don't need all these crazy activities, crazy nightlife, parties, all these different activities and events. Like, I don't really need all that. I'm very happy with a nice beach, nice weather, and a good vibe. That's all I really need. And that is what Australia is. I think Australia is a very chilled out place with a good vibe, amazing scenery and weather. But in terms of activities, I feel like a lot of people, because it's such a popular travel place, think there's going to be all these crazy, amazing activities in Australia. And whilst there is, obviously, in certain places, it's definitely nowhere near the same scale as you're going to find in Europe, America, stuff like that. And I think in Australia, there is less activities, I think, than maybe is hyped up about. Yeah, it is just a very chilled out place. It's more the sort of place where you're just going to come and live a very chilled out lifestyle, which is perfectly suited to someone like me, and it might be for you as well. In terms of activities, people rave about it being like this place where you go and have a mad time. Of course, you're going to have the best time in Australia. I love it so much, but there isn't loads to do. And if you're the sort of person that doesn't like a chilled out life and need loads of stuff going on, you probably are better suited in Europe or something where there is loads of stuff in your face. Australia is very laid back here. And in terms of activities, it probably is a bit overhyped, because that's not what Australia's like. Point number 4 is the wildlife hype. Now, when I moved to Australia, I thought I would be seeing like kangaroos, koalas everywhere. I thought it was going to be so cool just walking down the street and seeing like koalas in the trees. Obviously, this is a bit of a stereotype, and most likely, I think people know that that's not fully going to be the case. But honestly, unless you really go and look for the wildlife in Australia, like, I haven't seen much at all. I've seen a lot of wildlife on like tours, when we've gone to the jungles, on boats. That's when you see a lot of the wildlife. But day to day, you don't really see much Australian wildlife. And I feel like Australia gets hyped as being this crazy place where there's kangaroos, koalas, wallabies everywhere, and you just see them as part of daily life. But from my experience, you don't see a lot of the wildlife in Australia unless you live somewhere quite remote and actually go out into nature a lot. Then you might. But again, living in the cities, the whole hype to do with wildlife is definitely blown way out of proportion, because you don't see that much living here in Australia, to be honest. Point number 5 that might be a bit overrated is the laid back lifestyle and the whole work-life balance. Now, I'm including this one because I think Australia, people move here expecting that they don't have to work much at all. They don't have to work as hard. There's a crazy work-life balance where you can have so much time off. But from my experience, whilst Australia is a way better place to live than the UK, you still have to work just as hard. And even though your time off might be better, from my experience, you don't get any more time off than you would back home necessarily. And I think people expect it's going to be this where they can just chill on the beach all day and relax. But in reality, when you're working 5 days a week, one of them days off, you've got to sort all your stuff and do your chores. You find that life is similar to back home. You're just in a very nice location now. But I think, you know, there's a whole thing about the work-life balance being amazing in Australia. I think that's overhyped, to be honest. I think you've got to work just as hard in Australia as you would if you're back home in the UK, for example. Obviously, when you travel in Australia, you can see some amazing places and really live that lifestyle. But for me, the whole work-life balance is hyped up a bit more than it should be. And the last overrated thing in Australia is sports. And I know you guys are going to comment on this one, but from my experience, maybe it's just me, to be honest, and not getting particularly involved with Aussie sports, because back home in the UK, I would only really watch the football anyway, so that hasn't really changed since moving here. I still only watch the football in the UK. For me, I feel like, especially judging by the comments on a recent video I did where the Aussies were pretty defensive about their sports and that their sporting scene is better than the UK. From my experience, the UK sporting scene is way better, and I think it is a bit overhyped in Australia. The whole sports. I think Aussie rules is quite big here, but even then, the hype for Aussie rules here is nowhere near as big as what it is for the football in the UK. And whilst it is a massively overrated, from my experience, I think the way Aussies talk about it, I don't know. I don't really see that much. I don't see people walking around in Aussie rules tops so much like you would in the UK football tops and stuff. I don't know. I feel like it's a bit overhyped, the sporting scene here. So there is some overrated things about living in Australia. There is definitely an even longer list, to be honest, of underrated things in Australia. I think this is just some things which I believe are probably hyped a bit more than they should be. But obviously, as I said, I'm not calling these things bad. I personally love living in Australia, and I like the way Australia is. I like the chilled out lifestyle. There's not too much going on. That's the sort of lifestyle that suits me the most. But there's no doubt that some things about Australia are a bit overhyped. Thank you for watching this one. If you need help moving from the UK to Australia and are looking to make the move yourself, I have now released a guide for moving to Australia. That one's at the top of the description. But yeah, thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts on this video in the comments, and I'll see you very soon with another video.